of reading our Parshiot. This week we have Parshat Tazria and Metzora, which I'm sometimes fond of saying are the Parshiot that every B'nai Mitzvah kid, when they're assigned, utters a collective groan, because I suppose no 12 or 13-year-old wants to give a Devar Torah about leprosy and skin diseases, which is perhaps why plenty of kids and rabbis decide to talk about other parts of the Torah portion or just talk about other things entirely. But it was suggested to me that we actually maybe focus on that very fact, on the tzarahat, on the skin disease and some of the thinking around it and behind it today. And I was mentioning to a few people this week, actually, that I don't know about you, but this parsha has spoken to me in an entirely different way the past now 3, almost 4 years, than it ever did before, and has a relevance perhaps that it, at least for me, never did before. So I thought we'd get into it a little bit and kind of explore that. But before we do, Counselor David?
Yes.
Oh, you're muted.
Our son Daniel, who he and his wife are expecting their first baby, his bar mitzvah was exactly, 19 years ago, and this was his parsha, and the rabbi apologized to him.
See?
I'll never forget, and says, a lot of kids, they have things with a heroic Jew or something like this. You got stuck with the Tazora, but he did an interesting one about gossip and social media and how this deals with gossip and with the technology. And I think it was, they didn't have WhatsApp or whatever they had, MySpace, I think it was, that's obsolete. And he says with MySpace, you send somebody something and it goes around the world. So every year I always have pleasant memories of his bar mitzvah in Wilshire Boulevard Temple and see how he's growing up.
Well, I'll actually use, thank you, David. I'll use that. We could have invited him to come lead Torah study today. Well, I'll use that. Cindy, I see your hand. I'll use that just as a jumping off point because it's not in what I was planning to talk about today, but I do think it's relevant. And a lot of us may have heard, right? The rabbis spend a fair amount of time trying to figure out, what did the people do? What sin did they commit? What transgression did they commit for which they were punished by this affliction, this it's not actually leprosy, but this sort of, skin disease, right? Because that's sort of the worldview and the mindset that our ancestors lived in, that there were consequences for behaviors and that this was some kind of cosmic consequence for action. And their conclusion is that the transgression, the sin that this was punishment for was the sin of gossip, was lashon hara, right? Literally the evil tongue. Many of us have probably heard Rabbi Leader fondly teach that this line of Talmud that says that the tongue is so powerful that it is kept behind 2 gates, the teeth and the lips, right? And words have a tremendous amount of power in our tradition, right? If we go back to the very, very beginning of the Torah, in the creation myth, that God creates the world by speaking, right? God says, "Let there be light," and light is created. God creates the world through words, through speaking, and an awful lot, as we all know, can be created with our words, relationships, all kinds of things. But so too, our words have the power to destroy also, right? The sermon that I probably and every rabbi has given 1,000,000 times is that whoever said sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me was an idiot, right? Because, wounds and bruises, physical wounds anyway, heal with time. All of us know that. But I can still tell you what a kid said to me in 3rd grade that, broke my heart then, right? And as most of us probably can. So that's a big deal for the rabbis. And One of my, there's different versions of the story, but one of the things I certainly used to do at camp, which to illustrate this point is, there we go, is to take a down feather pillow on a breezy afternoon, to tear the pillow open, to shake all the feathers out of the pillow, and then explain and ask the campers to collect all the leaves and put them back in the pillow, which of course you can't do, right? Or some people do it with a tube of toothpaste, right? To squeeze out a tube of toothpaste and then ask somebody to put the toothpaste back in the tube, which doesn't quite work so well. And the rabbis say that this is the same with our words, right? That once we say something, it's out there. You can't take it back, to David's point. And interestingly, and maybe we'll talk about this for a minute. Cindy, I haven't forgotten your hand. Maybe we'll talk about this for a minute before we get into some of the other commentaries that I've brought. We ordinarily think of Lashon Hara and of gossip as being, speaking ill of someone else behind their back, right? Spreading rumors, something that's not true. But the rabbis say that, yes, that is Lashon Hara, that is gossip, but that it is also Lashon Hara even if you're saying something complimentary about someone else. That speaking about someone else behind their back, whether what you're saying is positive or negative, is a no-no. And maybe think about that for a minute while I call on Cindy, and maybe let's spend a couple minutes as to maybe why that might be. Right? Why is it still gossip if we say something positive? Why would that be problematic? So while we're thinking about that, Cindy, you've been patiently waiting.
Okay, well, my point, I was just going to say my grandson's portion was this last year, and he related it to COVID. But now I have a question.
Please.
Is it wrong to say so-and-so is sick? Let's all get together and help her.
Ooh, great question. I would say no, right? Because it's in pursuit of something, right? It's not simply for the sake of talking about it, right? If you take away the let's get together and support them, right? And it's just, oh, did you hear? She's battling, whatever, right? COVID.
You can't inform people that someone's having a hard time, but if you're going to help them, it's okay.
Yes. And look, I mean, here, look, we could dance on the head of a pin, right? You're informing that someone has a hard time, maybe with the intention that that person will then know and reach out and support them and help them, right? So I could argue that that's certainly, admirable and fine. But yes, I think, what did Potter Stewart say, right? I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. I think it's similar, right? When we're sharing something to try to affect some kind of action or change, we know that. And when we're sharing something just for the sake of sharing it because we don't know what else to talk about, I think that's more the category that the rabbis are trying to address. We probably all know, I certainly know people in my life who are lovely folks, but it seems like every time I'm in a conversation with them, the conversation ends up being about other people because that's comfortable and easy to talk about as opposed to something else. And again, it doesn't have to be malicious, but what good is going to come from that, right? I think is the rabbi's point. What good is going to come from, a couple of us sitting around having a cup of coffee, talking about somebody else's life and their business that it's really, frankly, none of ours, if we're not going to get involved in it, or we're not going to help, or we're not going to support or be there. Okay, Rebecca and then Penina.
But couldn't it also pertain to wanting support? So if you're sitting around drinking coffee and talking about someone, maybe you're looking for a commonality or support for whatever that conflict or I'll say conflict. You're looking for support.
Well, if you're engaged in it, right, I think that's also, a bit different, right? If you're looking for support about an interaction that you had with someone else, well, then that's in part anyway, 50% at least, right? Your story to tell, right? It's something that happened to you in your experience, which is different than just, oh, did you hear what happened to her? Or did you hear what happened to him, right? Their house just got foreclosed on or whatever, right? To me, it's different as, she said the meanest thing to me last week. And, that while also is maybe problematic because they're not there to defend themselves, it is an experience that you had, right? And we all have I think, prerogative to talk about something that actually happened, that we were actually a character or player in. Panina and then Susan.
I was exposed to a sentence, החיים והמוות ביד הלשון, when I was growing up, and I heard it many times, and I don't know where it came from, which wise man.
Panina, will you translate for us?
Excuse me?
Will you translate for us? For those
החיים, the life, והמוות, and death, ביד הלשון, in the hands of your tongue.
Right.
And that's something very powerful, especially if somebody thinks that they want to show how clever they are and they say something that actually could cause a lot of people's life. Like espionage, for example, stuff like that, you never know. So, yeah, החיים והמוות ביד הלשון. That's how I look at it.
True. Susan, that's a beautiful garden behind you.
Thank you. It's my backyard. Being that my computer doesn't fit in my backyard, there are no plugs back there. I'm using it for my.
Small is prettier.
So,
Small is pretty.
thank you. Okay, several things. One, I think you have to know to whom you are speaking. Second of all, you have to know if your words can potentially help the person whom you are about whom you are speaking about. Cindy's proposition that she wrote was a good one. You don't want to spread, if the person doesn't want to be known that she's sick, you don't want to be spreading it. On the other hand, if you know a person who could help that person, who likes that person, then, I mean, it's a matter of judgment to whom you are speaking, I believe. And then some of it might be putting too much of a fence around the Torah when you say you can't compliment somebody else. It's the question is, what can that hurt? That again you have to have some seichel behind all of these things. And the other thing is another thing in the Torah is don't put a stumbling block before a blind person, which could be also don't do a stumbling block before a deaf person. So you don't want to insult the deaf who can't defend, who aren't hearing and can't defend themselves. But I think there are a lot of ramifications to it, and taking it too far in one extreme is not necessarily helpful. On the other hand, Jonathan Sachs today, I usually read him when he comes out with the Torah commentary. It comes out line on Fridays, talks about internecine problems within Jewish groups, Jews spreading calumny against other groups. And I mean, I think that's a recurrent thing. And Jews who are opposed to more traditional, bringing calumny to the public officials and all the problems that has caused. So anyway, that was a long-winded comment.
No, I think it's a really interesting point. Yeah, I would agree that it is absolutely the idea of not speaking about others, even if it's something positive or complimentary, is absolutely this concept of a siag l'Torah, right? A fence around the Torah, trying to create a restriction that is more restrictive to stop us from breaking a less restrictive commandment or law. Because it is, I think, this notion of, well, maybe it starts out as a complimentary conversation about someone else, but who knows where that's going to spiral off to, right? And so if we're in the business of talking about other people who are not around, it's very easy for that to slide into gossip, even if it begins as something complimentary. The piece about that you began with, Susan, about sharing, let's say, if someone else is sick, because it could be to help them. And you have to think about your audience. I think it's also thinking about the person who's sick, and frankly, asking them, when you learn of their illness, what they want. I mean, it may not be a secret. Certainly, I and the rest of the clergy often know of people who are battling all kinds of illness and other difficulties in their lives, and we do usually, not always, but usually share that with each other in confidence. But always, when someone tells me something or I learn of it, the first question I ask them is if it's okay if I share it with the rest of the clergy, because they would want to know, or they would want to be able to reach out and support. But I always ask, is it okay if I share this with someone else? And sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's no, and you have to respect that. Because I think we're all different, right? Many of us feel supported by people knowing whatever it is we're going through and reaching out and being there for us, and some of us feel like that's an intrusion, and is one more thing to manage and deal with when there's already other things we're managing and dealing with, and we feel like we have that support, and that's, I think, that is not our choice, that is their choice. Right. And that's, I think, connected to this too, is it's not our place, it's not our business to be out there parroting, someone else's struggles, or someone else's accomplishments that someone who's incredibly modest and doesn't need anyone to know that they just won the lottery or whatever it is, right? That's what you would think, oh, who cares? That's amazing. They got a promotion. They did this, they did that. They just had a grandchild. Maybe that's not, whether we agree or not, our business. Oh, I got a bunch of hands. I must have offended people. Okay. Merle, and then Brad, and then I see Eric.
So years ago, when I was the volunteer coordinator at our temple in Phoenix, I was, so to speak, stuck with these two parsha in order to create a drash for volunteer Shabbat. And I struggled with it, but came up with ways to turn it into something complementary. So listening to this, and these, not everybody comes to Shabbat services, even though they're all invited, many were there. And we hand out a booklet at the time with the names of the volunteers and what they've done or whatever. Was that the wrong thing to do, where there were people in the room as well as not in the room, and but they were being thanked for things that they did that were major that the temple could have done without them?
It's just so I'm clear. So when you say you turned it into something positive,
right? But is that considered gossip because it's complimentary? We were in front
of advertising, what people did to volunteer to support.
Right. I don't want to feel guilty 20 years later.
No, I mean, again, I'm sure some might disagree. Some here might disagree. Some rabbis would disagree. I do. I think I think giving someone credit for something is not quite the same as gossip.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, I feel better now.
To me, someone else might argue it, but I think to me, again, that's different than, Merle, you and I are sitting at lunch, and
right,
with all good intention, I mentioned that Susan was so thoughtful and sent a dozen bagels and lox from Zabar's to me. Hint, hint, Susan. Just kidding. And how thoughtful that was. And then, again, in the minds of the rabbis, and then that, quickly turns into, well, that's so thoughtful of her, but, she didn't do that for me when I had my, gallbladder taken out. And I wonder if it's because I offended her, and then the next thing you know, we're having this, right? That is how easy it all good intentions, ends up in a tricky spot. But I think that giving someone, credit for something, and I could argue that in a way it's not gossip because it's public, sort of, right?
Okay.
Right. We at the Car Center, for example, some of you may know this. We have a donor wall, the way almost every organization does. But the Car Center donor wall is a bit different in that it does, like all donor walls, recognize people who have made financial contributions above a certain level to support the amazing work that we do there. However, it also recognizes people that have contributed significant amounts above a certain threshold of their time, right? And recognizes that equally alongside a comparable financial donation, to acknowledge that both are donations, that both matter, right? That all the money in the world doesn't get the work done without people to do the work, and all the people to do the work doesn't get the work done without the money to make it all happen. But you could say the same thing, right? Is that us, I don't know, bragging on someone's behalf that, oh, look, they've donated, I believe it's 10,000 hours. Is that calling attention to someone that might not want that attention called to them, right? But you can make the same argument for a financial contribution. But it's in a public space, I think it's a little different than, behind closed doors. Brad and then Eric.
Rabbi, I'm thinking about this prohibition against positive as well as negative type of gossip, quote unquote. And I wonder if the goal isn't to elevate the conversation to maybe a more intellectual or spiritual level. It's not just in prayer that we can find spirituality. Maybe it's in our everyday conversation with each other. And maybe that's behind both the condemnation of negative, but also positive gossip, just to raise the whole level of the conversation.
It's a great point to say, right? Don't you have better things to talk about than this? Right? No, but really, right? That's a great point, right? To try to, which I do think much of our tradition is attempting to do, is to try to elevate us and push us to be better, to treat others better, and that we can, again, no malice, but yeah, one could certainly argue that it's lazy. If the best thing you have to talk about with somebody is someone else, it's lazy in a way. Eric, you've been waiting so patiently.
No, I was just going to say it's obvious, but we have this $786 million settlement of a suit for lying about other people in public on the air, and I just think that this ramifies back to what we're talking about here. I mean, it's drastic.
100%, right?
But
someone will know better than I. I'm blanking on the case, right? But with the old
Fox.
Where do I go to get my reputation back, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the right. And yes, it's obvious, but I hadn't thought about it. You're right. I mean, we have there are laws on the books against slander and libel for a reason.
But the more general thing is that we talk about throwing stones in Torah and so forth. I mean, words are like stones in this. That is the idea, and we have to be very careful about what we do with them.
Yes, there's a reading in an old High Holy Day Machzor, a Yom Kippur reading. Part of it's an introduction to one of the sets of al-chetz, right? One of the sets of litanies of transgressions that communally we've all committed, and it compares words to daggers, and it's something to the effect of the words that we the words that we speak, that we hurl like daggers into the hearts of those we claim to love, something along those lines, right? And you're right, we don't think of it that way, but they are. And it's so, maybe kids today don't hear the sticks and stones thing. I certainly don't say it to my kids, but we all certainly probably as kids heard it. And it's just, yeah, I mean, we can all remember things that people said to us that hurt, that, you move on, but it doesn't go away.
May I ask a question?
Yes, Donna. And
Um,
then Pamela.
You know that ever since 9/11, see something, say something. And you want to make sure everybody's safe. And you have someone tell you things that they can be deployed folks and saying things, but you don't want to take the chance that they may be serious. They make reports. So I'm okay. Everybody's all right. But it's just I don't make up stories, and I try to have integrity, and I don't want to say something about someone that's not true. But at the same time, I witness it, and they're not doing anything about it yet. But luckily, I'm going to court later after I get married and testify. And I want the judge to put a gag order on him because I'm not going to. I don't want to upset anybody Shabbat, but this man needs to go upstate to Sacramento. And when I said that, there was a bonfire a couple of days ago in Sacramento. He did it. When I went to the Top Gun theater, Top Gun movies at Pacific Grove, he was the only one who knew that I went there. He did that. He's the one that we called to threaten the temple, and the police took him away. I want to know why. I called Gaston, and I called a lot of people. I said, why is this man walking around free in our city? So pray for me, because I'm fine. Because between John and IDF and Rabbi Leader and everybody else, I'm just perfectly fine.
Well, it's, Donna, it's a really good point, actually, that, when is it our place to involve ourselves in something and say something and speak up, and when is it not? Right? You're driving on the freeway and there's someone driving, 2 lanes over who you think may be, intoxicated. Is it your place to call CHP? Or just keep driving and it's none of your business, right? Or anything you see, right? It's the bystander effect in a way, right?
The fire chief's got a picture. He's an arsonist. He bragged about the 2019 Barnum Hill fire by the studios that's unsolved. I'm not going to upset people with Shabbat. There's a long list. That's why Joe Biden brought me back, signed letters. I've been doing intel for a year with this person. He's a Nazi on the 5th floor who hates the Jews, hates the blacks. And I have a letter from Kama. So I was always really concerned. So I'm working on my music career. I'm going to be in the public with all these important people that I don't want anyone hurt, especially at the wedding or anywhere else. So I'm just doing the best I can do. Yep. There's been 3 knives to come towards my throat this week, but miraculously they changed their minds and went the other way.
Well, Donna, I think you hit the nail on the head. All you can do is the best you can do. Pamela, I'm gonna give you. You've been patiently waiting.
Thank you. Hopefully, I'll say things very succinctly. Thank you. Number one, I guess, going backwards, more important or equally important with the fact that you choose to say something or not say something is the intention with which you say it. I've heard a comedian, or many comedians, talk about you can insult someone, but if the person that loves you says that same word, it doesn't have the same effect at all. Mm-hmm. So I think right now, in society, we're just at a time where people are, as you said, using words like daggers. There's certainly plenty in Psalms that David spoke about people piercing his heart with their tongues, and God, deliver me from those that speak evil against me. However, since to me, we were created to be a blessing to others. Our mouths are supposed to bring forth healing, is what I read in the Psalms. So healing is even more important now, I believe, because there are people throwing heinous things against human beings that I don't even know. And I would very much want to be able to comfort people and give them some sense of peace while they're having all these terrible things happen to them. And I do think it's important to not, what do they call that? Throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
But give people an opportunity to, and as I said, I really do believe we need to do more speaking well of others in public. Sigmund Freud's nephew said, even the truth needs publicity.
Yeah.
That's
It's interesting that you made a great point of the intention perhaps mattering. I'm just thinking literally this week, 3 nights ago, Ashley and I were watching the Chris Rock Netflix comedy thing from, I don't know, a week ago, 2 weeks ago. And I forget which particular bit it was. But he was, ranting on about some commercial business. I think it was Lululemon. And Ashley turned to me and she said, how is that not libel or slander? Right? What he's saying. And I said, well, because it's comedy. It's in jest, maybe, right?
The legal definition is if it's in comedy, if it is meant to be a pun, you can say anything.
Right. And that's also, I think, maybe we're losing some of this gray area in our world today, but the difference between something that is clearly malicious or comes from an unkind or not thoughtful place, and something that is either a careless comment or something that is meant to be funny, doesn't make it any less offensive, potentially, right? Or something that someone shouldn't take responsibility for. But I do think, I think you're right. I think that intention certainly is a part of the conversation, to say the very least, and absolutely negative things certainly get a lot more airtime often than positives. This is I will preface this by saying this is not me fishing for myself or any of the other clergy for positive things, but I often say, and some of you probably heard me say, I often say to people when they say something nice or compliment something that the temple did or we did, I said thank you, because we always hear when we screw up, always, right? And hear far less frequently when we do right by somebody, right? If someone reads my Shabbat message and they think that I'm say something horribly offensive, I hear about that. I also thankfully hear when people find it meaningful. But it's easy to react to something negative.
I can't imagine anybody criticizing you.
Right? Absolutely. But I think that's also a good reminder on this theme of the power of our words. We have the choice whether we want to use our words to tear other people down or whether we want to use our words to build other people up. And that's a responsibility, I would argue. David.
Sure. Well, the somebody mentioned a false TV show, I think the Fox thing, whatever. But in the Torah, truth is not a defense to something.
Correct.
So, of course, in libel and slander, it is, as Pamela mentioned, who, by the way, Pamela's and I are classmates at a Torah study through Mount Sinai Temple. I've guessed it at her temple before. But anyways, so it doesn't matter.
True timing us, David.
It doesn't matter if someone says something true, if it's done in a negative way with a negative intention. If I go, hey, look at her. Doesn't the plastic surgery on her look good? Well, now, how could it be? Maybe that man or woman's plastic surgery, it does look good, but is it made in a catty context as opposed to, well, gee, say you haven't seen somebody in a number of years, and then you say, to your spouse or whatever, hey, I haven't seen, Joe in, a number of years. He looks great. That's not catty. Anyways, that goes towards intention. And unlike defamation and libel, which are legal principles, truth is no defense to gossip, especially in the Torah.
Right. That's a great point, right? It is still gossip, if you say, boy, you would never know she's had her face done, right? That's,
I haven't had mine done yet. I'm 70.
We would never know, right? Gary,
Well,
we would never know you've had your face done.
good to know. Good to know. Thank you. Is there Lashon hearing as opposed to Lashon speech?
Oh,
Because I can say something with the best of intentions. I played golf with Dr. Smith yesterday, and he was a good golfer. And you hear that going, well, he, played timely, he obeyed the rules, he was a fun companion. And Brad is sitting there thinking, I'm never going to go to that Dr. Smith. He spends all his time playing golf. Why isn't he taking care of patients? Now, I meant it in a good way, but Brad, Brad, he heard it in a bad way. So is there?
great question. So not to my knowledge anyway, not in the sense of that being, the burden being on the listener as a transgression, sort of in the same way that it is on the person speaking. But it's absolutely another reason, the rabbis say that Lashon Hara hurts everybody involved, right? It hurts the person you're speaking about. It hurts the person who's saying it, and it hurts the person who's listening to it, right? So that's also part of it, right? The unintended consequences that can't be, that's back to the pillow and the toothpaste thing, right? That once it's said, where it goes and how it's interpreted and what becomes of it is far out of one's control. And so I think that's part of the argument there is that, yeah, so you said it with good intentions, right? Or it's true, but now that you've put it out there, you have no idea what Brad's going to do with that, right? Or what anyone else is going to do with that. So I think it's less that the person hearing it is somehow responsible for it, and more that it's one more, it underscores why it's still so problematic, because yeah, you have no idea how the person's going to hear that and what they're going to do with it and how they're going to take it. And that's also why it's so powerful. I think that's what the rabbis are trying to show us is like, look, this is so powerful. You think you're saying something great, and it ends up in a whole other context, in a whole other place. Eric.
But Pamela brought up Freud's nephew, which is an interesting reference. That was Edouard Bernays. And he was in New York, and he is regarded as the founder, the guiding spirit of public relations. He created the public relations industry. And so we're talking about this, Sean, but we have whole companies, whole floors of bright people working on creating words to influence people. And what does God think about this?
About using words as a means of influence? Look, I think that's probably as old as time, right? The powers of persuasion and using words. I think, again, right, it's a question of how, right? And while yes, truth is not a defense for gossip, it's are we misleading in that, right? And that look back. We can go back to the beginning of the Torah, right? We can go back to Genesis, right? And Adam and Eve and the apple and the snake, and right. There's countless examples of persuasion in the Torah. Sometimes that's nefarious, sometimes that's innocent. And so the intention, I think, back to Pamela's point, definitely matters, and whether it's malicious. And I saw part of what just got put in the chat. Let me just see. David said, yeah, a lie gets halfway around the world, but the truth gets its pants. Yeah, this is true, right? It's true. All right. And look, it's the boy who cried wolf also, right? That it, it's interesting. There's a few different Torah portions that stress the importance of having honest weights and measures, right? Generally speaking, it's thought that they're talking about the marketplace, right? And I whenever I read that, I think about being a kid and going to the grocery store, the butcher shop with my mother, and her, getting deli turkey or pastrami or whatever, and telling me as a little kid to always make sure that the butcher didn't have his thumb on the scale, right, while he's piling up the meat, so I don't get charged for extra. And just as a consequential side note, in high school, I volunteered at the Santa Barbara County Regional Food Bank, and the one of my jobs was to process donations that came in. And the whole process was, there was this huge kind of scale built into the floor in the warehouse, and people would come with a car full of day-old bread or whatever that they were donating, and we'd load it up onto the scale. And without fail, every day, at least once, if not a few times, whoever had brought in the food that they were donating would forget to step off the scale before I calculated the donation, right, in the hopes that they're going to get a bigger tax receipt. And it's, we kind of think it's funny, but what they're really saying, I think, to your point, is, dishonesty in the marketplace tears at the very fabric of a society, right? And, if it's the same thing, right, with our words and how we're using them, and the ripples that has beyond ourselves for the people around us and for the places in which we live. Let me just see here. Brad, and then I saw another hand.
Rabbi, I'm trying to approach this from a little bit different angle. If the Torah doesn't want us talking about other people, what does it want us talking about? And I guess my premise is that it does want us to be talking, as opposed to, say, ascetic monks who take a vow of silence because of the danger that words might represent. So I'm assuming that the Torah wants us to talk with each other, despite the dangers that may represent. But what are we to be talking about if it's not other people?
Look,
does the Torah give us guidance about that?
Not anywhere that I've seen, anyway. But I think I see Panina. I think, the flip answer, right, is anything else, right? Anything other than other people. Talking about ourselves, talking about, certainly the rabbis would
talking about the Torah,
right, would superimpose back onto the Torah that the Torah wants us talking about the Torah, or God wants us talking about Torah, right? That there always ought to be Torah on our lips, with tons of liturgy about that, right? In a traditional Shabbat prayer book, there's a piece of liturgy that comes usually when the Torah is put back in the Ark that talks about this idea, right, of Torah always being on our lips. But I think, again, I come back to this idea of it sort of being lazy, right? Like, there's so many other things to talk about in a contemporary context, right? Other things that are going on in the world, something God forbid we're vulnerable with someone else and share something that's actually happening to us, or that we're struggling with, or that we're dealing with, right? I would make the argument that in many ways, that's the most powerful use of speech and conversation, right? Is to be vulnerability, to be vulnerable, to show someone else that vulnerability, to build a stronger, deeper, more meaningful relationship as a result of that, right? That creates something, Brad, you and I talking about, Gary's golf game, not so much, right? Panina.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I read somewhere that they put three categories of people. They said that the real intelligent ones are going to speak about ideas, the middle are going to speak about events, and the real simple people will speak about each other. And I don't know who wrote it, I don't remember, but I read it somewhere and I was thinking about it, and it's kind of like really makes sense. To me.
It's true.
Okay.
It's true. Absolutely. I see a question in the chat. Susan, I was just saying, David asks, how does the Torah provide for cleansing for someone who's guilty of gossip? Great question. I read something actually this week about this parsha that something that I hadn't heard before, because nowhere that I've seen it in Torah anyway. I'm sure the rabbis address it elsewhere. Is Lashon Hara, prescribed with a certain remedy, the way that ritual impurity or other things are. But this commentary that I read earlier this week, and forgive me, I can't remember whose it was, otherwise I would credit it. In essence, said that this parsha, using this idea that we've been focused on here, that the skin disease is a consequence of Lashon Hara, takes it one step further and says that then the remedy for the skin disease is the remedy for Lashon Hara. That the isolation, the time away from other people, from the community, is the path back after this gossip. It's basically a timeout. Take that for what it's worth. Susan.
I think that's a great question. What's the remedy? Well, isn't some remedy for other sins to ask forgiveness, and then perhaps to publicize the fact that you were wrong, and make some sort of amends, even though the feathers can't be put back. All the feathers into the pillow, but you might put some of the feathers back. And I would add, for Lashon Hara, don't talk about politics. And that's one, it has become a really divisive and very hot-blooded topic. So
and dangerous.
And dangerous too. And I'm pleased that the rabbis at Wilshire Boulevard Temple try and keep it out, because you're gonna offend one group or another.
Well, and interestingly, Susan, to your point there, right? It's the very fact, and thank you for the I'll take it as a compliment.
Yeah, it is a compliment.
Right, the very fact that it is generally, I'll just say it differently, that by and large we tend to wade into topics of political topics less than many of our colleagues in other communities do. That in and of itself is something that it becomes divisive, right? There are many people who are frustrated. There are many people who are frustrated,
right,
that rabbi leaders isn't going to get up on Yom Kippur and talk about what a disaster Washington is or what have you, right? And for every person who's frustrated by it, there are at least one other person who says thank you, because that's not what I come to shul for, right? And I'm sick of hearing that everywhere else. And I both have validity, and everyone's entitled to their opinion. But yes, it's so much so that the very idea that we're attempting to not be divisive is in and of itself divisive.
That's interesting, but I know this from Seder tables or whatever, and the Jewish Journal was saying, actually, I think David Squeeza said, don't talk politics, but other people are complaining about all the rancor at the Seder table, and the rancor is from politics. It's not from Moshe, and it's not from God leading us out of Egypt. It's when they start with politics. And even at a Seder recently went to, everything was beautiful, and then they started talking politics. But, you could feel the intense emotion and anger, and Seder should be soothing, and coming together. And that's what I think the temple experience should be as well. But you're right. You might have, but so what if you offend those who are not pleased with your avoiding the political? They wouldn't be pleased if you took the stance that is opposite of them.
Right. Of course. The subtext in what they're saying is, I don't just want you to talk about politics. I want you to talk about my politics.
Exactly.
Right. Exactly. I want you to talk about politics as long as it's what I agree with.
Right.
But what I think is really interesting, I'm just thinking as you're saying this, Susan, which I'll do it, but I'm off challenged when others do, which is with 5 minutes to go, ask a question that has probably a 3-hour discussion behind it, which is to say, is the challenge or issue or problem talking about politics, or is it the way we talk about it? Because I would say, and this is only half thought through, but the fact that it seems like increasingly the only spaces in which one can talk about politics is in an echo chamber of like-minded people is also a road to nowhere, right? So there ought to be spaces in which these things can be discussed and disagreed upon and debated and worked through, that does not lead to more division. And is that the topic itself, or is that the means by which we discuss it, or the nature of the discussion itself? I still don't think personally that synagogue is necessarily, or at least the pulpit is not the place to do it.
Yeah, but people can join political groups or groups that think along same political lines.
Yeah,
there's nothing wrong with that, but they're at least advocating their position in these groups. But it's not necessarily good when there are going to be people of other views. And especially on YouTube, everything goes on YouTube today. The whole world could read it.
Hey, we're on YouTube right now.
I know, that's what I just said.
I know, right? And I'll say this in a minute left, and maybe you've said it before. It's interesting. Just personally, I remember very well now, going back 3 years ago, right? We were doing this. An awareness when the pandemic began, we first started doing this on Zoom. I remember being very aware of the fact that this lives forever. Right? That this is in that way, this is very different than us, sitting in learner conference room at the temple studying Torah at noon on a Friday. And, in 2 minutes when we're done, it's over. And you can go tell somebody what I said, but they can choose to believe you or not. 10 years from now, someone's going to sign on to the temple YouTube page, and God help them if they have nothing better to do. They're going to rewatch the Torah study from April 21st, 2023. And find some ridiculous comment that I just made 10 minutes ago, and think how crazy is that Rabbi Shapiro that he said this thing, and it's there forever, for better or worse. Maybe I'm more relaxed now, but I, at least in the beginning, felt a much more heightened sense of, well, this is again good back to where we began, a much more heightened sense of awareness and responsibility with what I said and say and the words that I use, because one, it's there forever, and two, the other piece, right? We're streaming right now, so there's 17 of us here on this Zoom. I have no idea how many other people are watching us live right now. I have no idea. And we're in a room together. I know who's in the room. I know who I'm talking to, right? On a Friday night, we're streaming the service. I know who's in the room, but I don't know who else is watching, and who else is going to watch an hour later or 2 hours later. And it's just a different dimension. And just for me, in a good way, has forced me to really think about the point of this parsha, right? The power of our words, and to not say things casually, as I think we often do, with no ill intention, but important. So today, I will say, it was an example of something that I love, which is I spent a few hours yesterday preparing a whole. I promise I have a whole source sheet, like 5 pages of all these texts that we didn't get to because we had a wonderful and fruitful and robust conversation about something else. And I love nothing more than that. I have something ready to go for next year on this parsha. But that I think, lest we need the reminder, it is the very reason that we engage in Torah study, week after week, year after year, is because it is hopefully, ideally, the catalyst for, robust, meaningful conversation. and who knows where the conversation goes. So thank you for indulging me in
Thank you.
what I don't consider to be a tangent. And really that only works if everybody's engaged. And so thanks everybody for showing up today.
Thank you. It was very important.
Conversation. And be thoughtful with your words.
Thank you.
Rabbi Shapiro.
Thank you,
Shabbat
Rabbi.
shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Don't worry, I'm gonna be fine. Hi there, Benina, I love you.
Keep smiling, sweetie. That's a secret. That's a
Everything's
good
fine. I got so much protection from the angels and Isaiah 54. Read Isaiah 54 about the widow and that's me. It's about, I know it is. Israel, but also me, the widow, and just read it. And I know it's me. It's gotta be. There's a rainbow over my garbage car. It's gotta be me.
If you're
Okay, sweetheart, I gotta go. Shabbat shalom. Gotta cook something.
Merle, I love you. Good to see you, Merle. But everybody, thank you so much. It's your voice, hearing your voices, bring joy to my heart. See you tonight. Words and words are all I have to take your heart away.